Hey everybody, Twisted here with the Open Resourcery, and today we're going to go ahead and talk about thought forms. Now, thought forms generally are, as with just about anything, energy with a consciousness, but as the part of the phrase thought implies, it is something that is mentally generated. So in this case, we can think about it as an idea with a consciousness. And when we go ahead and we look at what the different sorts of types of thought forms are, right? There are about four usually associated designations for a thought form based on how they're generated, right? So before we get into those, I just want to go ahead and state that any sort of idea you have, any sort of intention that you have, whether it's you keep it in your head or you talk about it, put it out there, in of itself is a thought form. It's going to have, in some way, shape, or form, a manner of purpose and thus consciousness. It can be something that is, very, very, very minute, or something that potentially even, whether it's just your own direct involvement in generating it, or going ahead and through multiple people contributing to this idea or thought, it developing a more mature consciousness that even in some cases can be similar to or rival that of a human being, or to a lesser degree, say, an animal. Well, granted, humans are animals, but, like a household pet like a cat or a dog, But in any case, let's go ahead and delve into the different designations of thought forms. And first off, I'm going to go ahead and mention tulpas. Now, the reason I'm mentioning tulpas first is because they are purely self-generated. And with the other ones that we're going to go ahead and mention, they don't necessarily need to be particularly self-generated. So, with tulpas, they are pretty much like an imaginary friend or an aspect of oneself, depending on exactly how you go ahead and frame it and how you go ahead and, generate it, that you go ahead and develop over time within your own mind. Like you're sharing the same headspace with this tulpa, this thought form. And as time goes on, you continue to feed it. The tulpa grows. It becomes its own distinct persona, its own distinct thing. The way that we can look at it psychologically is that it is just like someone who has multiple personality disorder, or now in the modern day, calling it DID, right? They're going to go ahead and be like an altar. And, as time goes on, you contribute putting energy and intent and developing and shaping this entity, this thought form. It can potentially get to the point where you go ahead and it can be separate from you. It can be generated from you, but eventually it can develop enough to be separate from you. Like, exists outside of your mind, exists outside of your body, whereas previously it was cohabitating with you. Now, when it comes to tulpas in particular, there is a good old thing to look out for of potentially causing a psychotic break that has been associated with the development of these. And that is very much understandable because think about it like this. If you go ahead and you're trying to develop an alter ego, whether it is through conscious or unconscious purposes, right? In an unconscious sort of manner, say you have a trauma that you're trying to escape from, whether it's something that happened in childhood or something that occurred more so, in adolescence or as an adult, that in of itself could potentially be harmful or just get in the way of you trying to live your life, regularly speaking. But that is not to say you can't successfully generate a tulpa that won't necessarily impede upon your life, upon you actually going ahead and doing what you do, accomplishing whatever you want to accomplish. You can coexist within that mental space. And depending on how much you develop it and what your goals are, once again, it can go on to live outside of you, go on to exist astrally and tangibly, whatever the case may be. And while it may be connected to you in some way, shape, or form, if you don't completely cut the cord, right? Then it can go ahead and accomplish tasks for you, or maybe be a means of bilocation, even, from my understanding. Now, bilocation in and of itself requires a different video, and more likely, explained by someone who is more proficient in the field than I will admit. But yes, that is the end destination of a tulpa when done, successfully and fleshed out. Now, just to go ahead and put the note out there, the term tulpa is derived from the origins that it has within Eastern mysticism, particularly that of Tibetan Buddhism, I believe. So, for those wanting more so in-depth information, that is the direction you should probably look for that sort of thing. Now, these other designations for thought forms are more so in line with the Western magical understanding and conceptions. The first of these, going from most simple to complex, is the Servitor. Now, a Servitor is, very simple, has a simple manner of consciousness. As the name serve implies, Servitor, but the serve part of it implies you're going ahead and you are programming it with your intent to go ahead and accomplish a particular task. You are imbuing it with energy. You are creating it to be just developed enough to go ahead and simply handle a task. Once that task is completed, the safest thing to do is to go ahead and deconstruct said servitor to be able to go ahead and make sure that there's no sort of lingering animosity or any sort of confusion or anything else that by having it around it could just go ahead and cause additional problems, to put it simply. And the best allegory that I can find amongst popular culture and different sorts of media is, for those who've seen Rick and Morty, the episode with Mr. Meeseeks, where it had a simple purpose, and not just the one in the episode, as there was multiple, but each of them had their own particular purposes. And they wanted to go ahead and, after accomplishing their purposes, they pretty much just ran rampant and were chaotic. And all they wanted to do was die, but they simply couldn't die until, eventually they were laid to rest. They couldn't necessarily do it themselves. So, that in of itself is what could potentially go wrong. It's a nice example of that. When you don't deprogram, you don't deconstruct a servitor. But they can be very useful for going ahead and accomplishing simple tasks. For example, maybe you need a mental reminder of, you know what, I need to go to a grocery store. And granted, most of us will probably go ahead and write it down on a shopping list or type it in our phones, something to that extent. But actually, maybe we just need a mental reminder. Maybe we're the type of person to take mental notes. Or maybe going ahead and sending an intention someone's way, sending a message someone's way like a courier. That is another means in which it could be useful. And I'm sure I could come up with plenty more examples, but we're just going to leave it there for now. The next level, or of the, hierarchy, you could say, of these different designations from the Western understanding, is that of an egregore. So, whereas the tulpa is self-generated and usually kept within your mind, unless you have the particular intent and purpose to evolve it to something outside of yourself. And something I forgot to mention about the Servitor and of itself is that the Servitor is something that is generated outside of you. It is something to be separate from you. The same case goes for an egregore. Now, an egregore is a conscious thought form that someone can, in fact, develop themselves, individually, but in many cases, it is probably better to go ahead and do so with multiple individuals as a group. And in many cases, as a egregore grows and spreads based on a particular intent, whatever it may be, it is going to be something that is connected to or draws power from multiple people on a consistent basis. And to provide that, sort of like example, any sort of brand that you see out there, say Walmart has an egregore. You see that logo, which acts as a sigil. That's another thing to talk about for another episode, sigils and such. But in any case, going ahead and seeing the logo, and when you think of Walmart, what do you think of yourself? What's the persona of Walmart? What is the sort of energy that is imbued with it? What sort of consciousness does it have? Well, it has its own egregore in some way, shape, or form. That is one example. Or one that I happen to, like a example that I usually draw up a lot, is that of Naruto, the character, released, I believe it was late 90s, early 2000s in manga form, and then it debuted, at least in America, in the mid 2000s. But, the original author, Masashi Kishimoto, he conceptualized the character, right? But, it wasn't just him who created the original manga. It was a team. So you had a group working on this character of Naruto, plus all the other characters that are in there, right? But we'll just stick with the singular one, the titular character for now. You go ahead and you have this entire team putting time and effort and energy into developing this persona of Naruto. And, then as time goes on, whether these individuals knew it or not, a consciousness grew with this as well in their own internal development, even before the manga was released to the public. You had to get it through the publishing, you had to go ahead and talk to advertisers about it. Like, there's quite a few steps, I'm sure, in releasing a manga novel, and all of that sort of thing. But then once actually released, whether it's getting a chapter in the Shonen Jump weekly magazine, or getting your first Tankobon volume out there, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but in any case, then you release it to the public, and the people become aware, and you grow yourself a fandom. And with that right there, the egregore, in this case being Naruto, grows and gets power, develops even more of a consciousness, and then thus the rest is history, and it gains more power over time. And then there are different cases of people seeing it in dreams, whether you want to say it's lucid dreaming within your own mindscape, and this is a sort of reality that you've constructed in your head when you're asleep, or maybe in the cases of astral projection when asleep, or even just heading to the astral plane, you may meet yourself Naruto, and you go ahead and interact with it, and that being an egregore in of itself, but it's a thought form that is able to interconnect with many individuals and have an influence. Just energy with the consciousness, and idea with the consciousness. And I will take a moment to note that such is the power of memes. Memes floating around, these ideas, they have consciousnesses as well. And the more people that pass them around, it gains more power. And thus they go ahead and, you know, become their own personas and identities based on the input of individuals and the way that the memes are spun. And I also take this moment to note as well that in mentioning Naruto as the primary example, right? You can go ahead and have the primary Naruto thought form that is gone ahead and, this is, you could say, is more so in line with Masashi Kishimoto's, intention of what Naruto is supposed to be. But then you have different variations of what other people, whether, they were on development team or, in the publishing or different fandoms, interpretations of Naruto, go ahead and do to that character, their own versions, the way that they see it, and input the energy, and thus can create multiple thought forms, right? When we're talking about intangible entities, we have our own physical bodies as humans living in this 5 sense, very solitary reality, but when it comes to intangible beings and thought forms, they aren't necessarily constricted by the same manners of, hey, look, we are one person. We are one individual solitary physical body. So, with that right there, that is the second designation. I think we can just leave it at that for now. The last one being God forms. Now, with this right here, with the implication of the term God, right? That in of itself is considered like, oh, it's higher, it's not necessarily dependent on human generation. Like, cause maybe it existed before humans, right? Now, granted, there are servitors and there are egregores and tulpas even that probably predate the existence of humanity, of course, but usually when we think of gods, we think of beings or entities that, either exist prior to or are on a higher realm or rung of, say, a ladder, Jacob's ladder of consciousness than, say, humanity. Now, we as humans can evolve into gods depending on whichever spiritual path you may follow, if you agree with that notion or not, but God forms are usually seen as being, higher than humans, as I noted before, and that level of consciousness in the thought form being more so pervasive. So, the idea being that, like, especially in the Norse pantheon, right, their understanding of these sorts of gods that exist is that they are conscious and aware that they thrive off the power of human contribution, that they may have existed before archetypally, but are not necessarily, in their particular forms, to say Thor, Odin, Loki, Hel, etc. They didn't necessarily exist in those particular forms, prior to man. Like, those, they were shaped by man themselves. So there really isn't much distinction between egregores and God forms, except that they are potentially of a higher rung, you could say, than humans, whereas egregores are a bit more similar to humans in a sense, or could be lower than, in terms of personality development. And, as with any intangible being, they're going to have a different way of perceiving things, but you could say that the God forms may have a more grandiose one. And, I think that just about covers it when it comes to the general concept of thought forms and the four base designations, you could say, that at least, people should know. in a common Western sort of sense. So, with all that, this is Twisted with Opener Sorcery. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed this one, and we'll see you next time. Stay frosty, Neguses.